Today it is my special pleasure to welcome Dr. Supriya Gandhi. Supriya is a senior lecturer at Yale University. Her research deals with Islam's interface with Indic religions in South Asia. Dr. Gandhi is vastly learned. She has studied in India, Iran, and Syria, not to mention the UK and the US. She has a BA from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, MA from SOAS, London, and another master's from Harvard University, from where she also earned her doctorate. Supriya is the author of The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shikoh in Mughal India. An innovative thinker, Supriya is the new voice needed to read history not written from a colonial perspective. I'm sure we will see a lot more of her penetrating writing in the coming years. Welcome, Supriya Gandhi.
It's nice to see you, and this conversation for me is a nice reminder of my recent trip to Lahore in January, which seems like another age now.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure meeting you here very, very briefly and attending your talk, which was just mesmerizing. So I'll start with my first question now. In today's polarized India, where even the name of a road, which was named after Aurangzeb, the Aurangzeb Road in Delhi, has been changed, is Dara Shikoh still an Indian prince, or is he the other now?
So there are a number of things going on, some that have been going on for a long while, and some more recent developments. Aurangzeb was always more well known than Dara Shikoh, precisely because he became emperor. So there was sort of a much long-lasting memory of him. He ruled for a very long time. So he always overshadowed Dara Shikoh. But Dara was still a beacon for many. He was a prince who was celebrated for his achievements, for his engagements with Indic religions. Now, for many, leading up to independence, the Mughals were not an alien dynasty. Indian historians, intellectuals in the pre-partition era, sort of even afterwards, looked to the Mughals as sort of the forerunners for what the modern Indian state would become. So ideas of pluralism, secularism, the kind of administrative unity were all seen to be prefigured in the Mughal dynasty. But then we had this narrative, which is not always the dominant narrative, but is a narrative that is gaining ascendance in our age of social media, when we do have a Hindu nationalist government at the center. We have this narrative that the Mughals were sort of alien interlopers, that they didn't really belong. So there was this call for effacing Mughals, for erasing Mughals from textbooks, or if they were to be included at all, they were included as invaders, as people who didn't really belong, who caused a lot of destruction, and somehow that destruction needs to be addressed in our current day. So that's sort of behind the name change of Aurangzeb Road. And of course, the ironic thing, which is which is partly the idea, is that to somehow zero in on removing Aurangzeb's name from this road that was named after him in Delhi, that of course brings more attention to the Mughal emperor and to the Mughal dynasty as a whole. Right. So there was this effort to remove Aurangzeb's name from the public space and also to bring Aurangzeb, a certain vision of Aurangzeb, into the public imagination in India. And then to somehow to sort of balance that out, there has been this recent attempt to revive the memory of Dara Shikoh, a memory that so far had existed in certain liberal circles, certain theatre groups, literary works, etc., but it wasn't quite as widespread. And now we do hear Dara Shikoh's name being invoked a little more widely.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. So, do you think that Dara Shikoh is a myth created by some historians, making us believe that he was a benign and pure prince as compared to his brother? Or do you think in reality, he was a very pure and benign person?
Okay, so the very fact that we ask this question has a lot to do with the ways in which these Mughal royals, whether Mughal emperors or other prominent figures like Dara Shikoh, exist in our imagination. So this has a lot to do with layers of memory making that have existed for a number of centuries, that have been built up, that have been informed by colonial conceptions of history that are really histories of great men. So in a way, these figures live amongst us and we think we know them. They seem sort of familiar. So depending on one's political leanings, ideologies, on which side of the border one lives on, just the name Dara Shikoh might evoke certain ideas and sort of impressions. The name Aurangzeb evokes certain other ideas. We might think of Aurangzeb's asceticism, his sewing of prayer caps, his piety, or on the other hand, someone else might think of Aurangzeb's bigotry and tyranny. Dara Shikoh might evoke the feeling of, this was someone who was like utterly incompetent, naive. He was a heretical Sufi. It's like probably a good idea that he was disposed of. Or on the other hand, it might evoke great empathy and great sympathy for this towering intellectual who really ought to have been given a chance to rule. So the idea that we can access the personalities of these figures, to enter their inner thoughts and their inner worlds, is an idea that has a lot to do with how they have been built up over the ages, and with our view of history as a history that's really peopled by these towering personalities. And nonetheless, it's certainly possible, going back to the sources, going back to what Dara Shikoh has written and what people have written about him, and looking at the layers of representation that are at play, it's certainly possible to arrive at a more complex view of both these figures, of both Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, and to situate them in their times and against the context of their times and the values of those times.
So while Dara was acknowledged as a crown prince much earlier in life, the persona that Dara developed around himself was of a mystic and a Sufi. So why didn't he develop himself as a military leader? Was there a strategy behind this?
So one thing to keep in mind is that for a Mughal ruler, for a Mughal prince who wanted to be a leader, the kind of cultivation of spirituality, spiritual self-fashioning, was not separate from all the other things that one needed to do to be a good ruler. A Mughal emperor didn't only rule through brute force. You recall the multi-religious dialogues that Akbar held in his Ibadat Khana, the translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian that gave him a genealogy and roots in India that connected him with all kinds of important symbols of sovereignty, including the figure Ram, the legendary sort of semi-divine prince or divine prince, or Jahangir's patronage of similar texts and ideas, Jahangir's dialogue with uh, uh, with the Hindu ascetic Chidrup. So all of these were ingredients of Mughal sovereignty, not only military prowess. Now, in Dara Shikoh's case, his father kept him close at the court for a number of reasons that we can go into in a bit. Now, this meant that Dara Shikoh didn't have the opportunity to go and actually be a resident governor in some far-flung province at the frontiers of the empire, where he could have had a little more independence away from his father and the ability to develop his own networks and military campaigns. On the other hand, we must also note that Dara Shikoh never shied away from military campaigns or warfare. He was very, very enthusiastic in 1653 about going to Kandahar, trying to seize that garrison city that was very important strategically for the Mughals, trying to seize it from the Safavids, and he went with great fanfare and with a lot of preparation, and in the end he was not successful. But other Mughal attempts to seize Kandahar were also not successful, so this can't be chalked up solely up to his own bad military skills. So Dara Shikoh actually tried to behave very much like a sitting emperor. Emperors held literary salons, they engaged in philosophical and intellectual activities, and they also engaged in actual governance. So Dara Shikoh tried to combine both of these aspects while he was still a prince.
Oh, okay. All right. That's very interesting. I would like to know, why didn't Shah Jahan want him far away? Didn't want him, at a distance from himself. Why did he want him to be very close to him all the time? What was the reason?
So this is sort of the paradox of Mughal succession. As the Mughals took root in India as a dynasty, they moved away from an earlier Timurid model of shared rulership. So here there was this model of really the survival of the fittest. There was no primogeniture. It wasn't as though the eldest son would automatically become heir. The princes would battle it out amongst themselves, and the one who prevailed would eventually succeed. And it wasn't always predictable who would do so. At the same time, seemingly, paradoxically, the emperors often had favorites, and they tried to root for their favorites, and they didn't always succeed. So Jahangir himself, at one point he did favor Khurram, with Shah Jahan, but then after a while, when he fell out with Khurram, he favored other sons. So Shah Jahan favored Dara Shikoh. He favored Dara Shikoh while, perhaps without realizing it, doing things that undermined Dara Shikoh's ability to actually take over. And in the end, during the War of Succession, it sounded like he was even arguing for some model of shared rulership amongst the sons, but that didn't work out.
Oh, okay. All right. Please talk about Dara's diverse spiritual experiences.
So Dara Shikoh's initial spiritual experiences were with the Qadri Sufi order of Mian Mir and Mullah Shah. Mian Mir was based in Lahore, where his mausoleum still stands, and Mullah Shah was based in Kashmir. It was initially Shah Jahan who actually introduced Dara Shikoh to this Qadri order. It wasn't something that Dara Shikoh just did on his own. Dara Shikoh was very, very ill, and as he writes in the later spiritual autobiography, Shah Jahan took him to visit Mian Mir, and then he was instantly cured. So this incident created in him a curiosity and a great reverence for the Qadri order and for Mian Mir, to whom he paid numerous visits. But from what we know from various unofficial chronicles of the imperial family's relationship with the Qadri order, Shah Jahan also cultivated a relationship with Mia Mir and Mullah Shah. In fact, there were many times when Shah Jahan met Mullah Shah when Dara Shikoh hadn't been accepted as Mullah Shah's disciple. And his elder sister Jahara was also very, very involved in this. So Dara Shikoh's Sufi spiritual experiences can't be seen as his alone, but ones that he engaged in along with his father and his elder sister. Later on, though, he started cultivating himself and representing himself as a prince who really had unique spiritual powers, that he alone had been granted this ability to meld the spiritual and the temporal, and the spiritual and the worldly, which was something that had been a challenge for other emperors and other rulers before him. So he started branching out also. He started going deeper into various practices imparted to him by his teachers, but he also branched out. He wrote to various other Sufis, Shah Dilruba, for instance, the Sufi Muhibbullah Allahabadi, the Chishti Sufi and scholar of Ibn Arabi, who was based in Allahabad. So he didn't restrict himself to the Qadri order, and as time went by, he became increasingly interested in Indic thought. He never, renounced Islam, but he drew on Indic sacred texts and Indic thought as a way of entering, for him, even deeper into various divine mysteries and divine unity, Tawheed.
Yes, I understand that he was into Vedanta and, he was exploring different ideas and philosophies. So I was just wondering, do you think that Aurangzeb was a devout Muslim in his earlier life, or did he become more religious after ascending the throne?
So, ideas of who a Muslim was, who a devout Muslim was in the 17th century were perhaps rather different from modern day ideas in certain contexts. For one, there's this modern idea that Sufism is somehow heterodox, it isn't Orthodox Islam, but Orthodox Islam is, is something that's separate. In the 17th century, in Mughal India, there wasn't really a conception of Islam, as lived practice without Sufism. In that, the ulama and the Sufis didn't have a strict division between them. Many of the people who were considered ulama were members of Sufi orders. They had they also had studied with various living Sufi peers, and they branched out with perhaps more of a focus on either philosophy or jurisprudence. I remember physicians were considered, and a governor and an administrator. It wasn't as though there was this separate class that was completely divorced from other aspects of life during the period. Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh both, as well as their other brothers, Murad and Shuja, they all had engagements with Sufi peers. So Dara Shikoh wasn't the only one who did. Again, he and his sister Jahara did. Aurangzeb had numerous contacts with a range of Sufi figures, whether they were Naqshbandis or Chishtis in Burhanpur. Again, it's probably a mistake to think that he only veered towards the more sober Naqshbandis and kept away from Chishtis. But it is the case that Aurangzeb's spiritual self-fashioning took a different turn from that of Dara Shikoh. So while both of them would have considered themselves to be devout Muslims, Aurangzeb's own religious practice and spiritual self-fashioning took a slightly more ascetic turn. And in order to distinguish himself from his brother, and legitimate his own ascendancy to the throne, he did start to portray his brother as a heretic, even though precisely how Dara Shikoh was a heretic, those ideas crystallized a lot later after he ascended the throne.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, do you think the Indic and the Persian cultures have interacted and influenced each other over centuries? And that Dara's translation of the Upanishads in Persian was the latest chapter in this continuous give and take that the two cultures have been having over, several centuries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That there have been long-standing engagements between Iran and India, between the cultures in a very sort of symbiotic sort of way. And one can, there's a lot that one can go into when you look at ancient Iran and ancient India, for instance. In the Mughal context, there are just innumerable ways in which one sees these kinds of cultural engagements and social interaction as well. As far as the more immediate predecessors for Dara Shikoh, of course, there is the model of his great-grandfather Akbar. And Dara Shikoh doesn't openly cite Akbar as his inspiration or his influence. But a lot of what he's doing is similar to what Akbar is doing, except that Akbar was carrying these activities out as a sitting emperor.
Okay. So, Supriya, what was the state of women in the Mughal realm? And what was the state of education? Not just of women, but of men too. So these are just two things, women and education.
Mm-hmm. So literacy as a whole in the pre-modern era was much, much less than literacy today, or even at the beginning of the 20th century, for instance. Literacy levels, it's hard to precisely gauge what they were really relatively very, very low. So writing and reading were elite activities. This doesn't mean that there was no contact between oral cultures, for instance, or and written cultures. There definitely was. The two informed each other. Mm-hmm. So education was limited to a few. At the same time, people tended to be multilingual, just as they are today in South Asia. So even the Mughals, for instance, whose initial sort of mother tongue was Chagatai Turkish, would be familiar with Turkish. They would speak a form of Hindi between themselves. They would be familiar with Persian. So multilingualism operated on many levels. In terms of Mughal women, elite Mughal women did have a fair amount of involvement in political life. They had quite a bit of financial clout. They were patrons of architecture. They were patrons of texts. Think of Zeb-un-Nisa, Aurangzeb's daughter, who was the patron of all kinds of literary and religious works. Or Jahara, who built numerous structures in Shah Jahanabad, in Agra, in Kashmir, and numerous other places. So Mughal women tended to wield quite a bit of influence, and often they've been written out of modern histories or seen as somehow peripheral, but they actually played a very important role.
Okay, that's very interesting to know, because there's an assumption that women were excluded and kept in the harems only. But what we see in the Mughal architecture, especially where there are mosques and mausoleums, built by the Mughals, there are small rooms which the guides would tell us were basically madrasas where young pupils or young youth were engaged in academics and thinking and literacy activities. Do you think those madrasas were like education for all, or were they restricted to certain class of the society?
Yes, I mean, we don't know a whole lot about the sort of the full extent and kind of detailed curriculum of madrasas. Especially when you're talking about primary or elementary education, there was certainly no concept of universal elementary education like one has in the modern period. But at the same time, there were growing numbers of people who accessed this education, which included Hindus as well as Muslims. And one does see a pattern of certain Hindu and Muslim communities or castes accessing this education and then building upon this to gain jobs in the Mughal administration. So we see the ascendancy of Kayasths, Khatris, and so on, who come to play a very important role in the Mughal administration, Sindhi Amils as well, for instance. And these are people who would access education in Persian. They might also learn some Arabic and some Quranic recitation. But they would be equally fluent in Hindi, for instance. So really, there's a whole range of linguistic and cultural competencies and worlds that these figures would straddle.
So what you're saying is that the general population probably may not have the academic education as we understand it today, but they were multilingual, so they had some kind of skills and they had some kind of indigenous knowledge, which was probably, maybe superior to so many other people or cultures in those times.
Yes, I think with multilingualism, especially, it was not always tied to formal education. Absolutely.
So that will bring me to my next question now. What do you think was Mumtaz Mahal's role in Dara Shikoh's life? Because we all know that really Shah Jahan preferred him as a crown prince for several years. But was the mother also partial towards Dara? Or was involved in his political life in any way?
That's an intriguing question. We don't quite know what role she played in, say, informing Shah Jahan's own preference amongst the sons. And of course, Shah Jahan's preference becomes really expressed outwardly later on, after she passed away. I mean, he was still a teenager when he lost his mother. We do know that she herself played an important role in statecraft, in assisting the emperor with his decisions, in keeping his seal, in stamping various nishans, decrees, together with her own trusted woman of the Mughal household, Satya Nisa. There are some descriptions of this in the Badshah-Nama of Qazvini, one of the earlier chronicles of Shah Jahan's reign. So we do get a sense that she played an important political role.
That's very interesting. In the end, please tell us, why was it important to write the story of Dara Shikoh's life?
So the story of Dara Shikoh and his brothers and the context is a story that hasn't really left us. It's a story that we tell and we retell and we invoke. And what I wanted to do was to really go back to the sources and tell the story with a lot more complexity and nuance. I wanted to set Dara Shikoh in his times and really look at his life and his intellectual project alongside the whole context of his times, to show really how what Dara Shikoh was doing was not merely spiritual. It was not spiritual without also being political, to see how these two were intertwined. When we look at histories of those who have lost in those who haven't really made it, who were not victorious, who didn't always succeed the throne, we can access a whole range of ideas that we might otherwise overlook, or our view of that age, our view of the early to mid 17th century would be colored by what we know of Aurangzeb's subsequent victory. So what if we look at that period, without necessarily thinking that Aurangzeb's rule was inevitable? We can really see and access a whole lot more. And I think it's important for us to look at history, to rethink history, to go back to primary sources, and build for ourselves just more complex and nuanced pictures of those times. Pictures that don't always have to be complete, and pictures that can lead to questions as well as conclusions.
That's very nice. That's a very good explanation why the story had to be written. Thank you so much, Supriya. Thank you for your time, and it was a delight to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, the brilliant and thoughtful Supriya Gandhi.